So, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Satoshi Nakamoto. Here's our cool Silicon Valley hockey stick. Up and to the right, exponential growth in the Google search terms for blockchain. Goldman Sachs, who I'd argue is probably the strongest analytical investment bank on earth, publishes a report every year called What If. What If tracks the trends of planet Earth. Last year's What If report from Goldman Sachs, first page, bold, underlined, what if I told you the blockchain could disrupt everything? Keyword there is everything. Not just going to disrupt finance, not just going to disrupt payments. This is going to be essentially the next generation of the World Wide Web. It will disrupt any business, any person, any machine that touches databases and internet technology. So how did we get here? 1950s, there were literally computers the size of me. They were managed by scientists with lab coats. And the output of those computers was literally paper. Paper that would come out of these Rolodexes on ticker tape. And in 1962, a gentleman by the name of Edgar Codd first created the relational database. The first time data was able to be stored and queried. In the later 60s, we had our first intranets. Standard Research Institute, UCSB, UCLA, and Brigham Young shared data between each other. And in 1970, MIT added a node. The key takeaway here is that the database and the internet grew up separately. The database and the internet grew up separately. I'm an American, no one's perfect. I accessed my internet through an internet service provider for the first time in 1996. My screen name was AKeys96, because that was the first year that I used it. I would log in to the internet service provider, and that's how I would get the information on databases. So basically, the internet service provider was essentially captivating the database. And that evolved into the oligopoly that we live in today, where we log into internet service providers and either socialize or have commerce through their databases. They are providing levels of trust and levels of intermediation. And for that, they extract extreme capital. So I think to a certain extent, it's worked out pretty well thus far. But you could argue that there are issues with the current way internet service providers basically silo and hold hostage our data. We can talk about the Equifax hacks. We can talk about kind of the Snowden revelations where government entities were able to log into databases and extract information about us. We can talk about the Enron fraud where certified public accountants literally just went into databases and changed information. We could talk about the citizens of Greece that are only allowed to take out 65 euros per day out of their bank's database. These are all issues where we're not sovereignly owning our data, our assets, and that's the problem. So, right as the capital markets imploded, a pseudonymous figure named Satoshi Nakamoto wrote a Bitcoin white paper called the Open Source Peer-to-Peer Money Protocol. And everyone understands the basic tenet of Bitcoin. I can send you the token without the bank in the middle. While it sounds relatively non-trivial, it was an absolute breakthrough in computer science. The two main technological breakthroughs were the solving of the double spend. So if I send you an email and I carbon copy that email, that's okay because the internet today is used for communication. But if I send you money and I send somebody else a carbon copy of that money, we'd have hyperinflation faster than Zimbabwe. The other one was the Byzantine generals problem, which was essentially how to form agreement, how to form consensus on the state of the database where nefarious actors could potentially be trying to corrupt the system. So Bitcoin, in my opinion, was the opening act, the gateway drug, generation zero of this technology, MySpace. Enter the Ethereum world computer. Keep this very, very, very simple. The internet expanded how we as humans communicate with each other, and Ethereum expands and simplifies how we agree and how we trust each other. And I believe Ethereum to be the next generation, the next transactional layer of the next generation of the internet. And I'll explain what I mean by that it's the transactional layer because there are other layers in the stack. So just a few stats. Ethereum right now is producing more transactions than all blockchains combined on a daily basis. Here's the transactional throughput. You'll see a lot of up and to the rights. That's a common theme with Ethereum. Wallets, up and to the right. Market cap, up and to the right. So, what is this going to feel like for the user? What is the next generation of the World Wide Web really going to feel like? There are three main components. One is the notion of self-sovereign identity. Two is the digitization or the tokenization of all assets. And three is the employment of smart contracts. Just a quick plug, tomorrow, Pele Brangard is here, just raise a hand. He's going to be doing an in-depth piece on Uport. I'm just gonna breeze over it right now, which is a self-sovereign identity piece, so I highly recommend you guys hearing that. So number one, self-sovereign identity. Every machine, every person, every business will have their own identity that they will custody rather than it being stuck in a SQL Oracle database. No offense to Oracle. Basically, you're going to have a browser, like when you log into Internet Explorer or Google Chrome, but it's going to be your browser. You may have a biometric that you attach it to. So your browser is going to be your identity. It's also going to be your wallet. It's also going to be a place where you house attestations and attributes about yourself. An attestation is how you conduct yourself in society, something equivalent to the 5 stars on a Uber rating or your credit report. An attribute will be a fact, a blood type maybe your electronic medical record, maybe the fact that you are indeed an accredited investor. Self-sovereign identity. Next is digital tokens. Planet Earth has a little bit of token fever right now, and I'll go into kind of how this has democratized somewhat of venture capital. But for this point of the conversation, realize that you're going to have natively digital formats of things like fiat, oil, gold, software licenses, file storage capacity, stocks, bonds, derivatives, loyalty points, Beyonce concert tickets, commodities, apples, livestock. They will all be natively digital. And you'll be able to move these things as easily as you send emails. And this is a great example of a parcel of land. So you have your GPS coordinate, you have this single address, and with this token, you'll be able to track the chain of custody and the authenticity of the asset of the parcel of land. You'll also be able to see the if it's publicly available, because you can privatize this information, the mortgage history. You can see if there are any liens on it. You can see if all the taxes are paid up to date. And then you'd be able to move this information without an agent, without escrow, without custodian. Real estate costs are extremely cumbersome. Now, more interesting is that you could subdivide this land token, let's say by the 300 of us in the room, and essentially create a real-time digital REIT, real estate investment trust. And a lot of the problems when you see real estate partnerships is if one person wants to sell their stake, it's difficult. You typically are all or nothing. But now you can digitize these assets, create secondary and tertiary markets, and have a tremendous unlocking of liquidity. This technology is really going to unlock liquidity in assets that we've thought were previously illiquid much more efficiently. And this will unlock the most liquidity I believe we will ever see in our lifetime. So self-sovereign digital identity, the tokenization of assets. Next are smart contracts. They're not really smart technically, and they're not really contracts. But they do essentially create business processes by which we can move these digital assets. And what you're seeing now is they're shadowing prosaic legal contracts. So rather than a Microsoft Word document drawn up by an attorney, recognized by a notary, that if there's a breach, it's very hard to stop the change of the assets. You're going to have natively digital agreements that if there is a breach, you could essentially stop the flow of those digital assets. Much more efficient and much more able to be controlled if there is a quote-unquote breach of contract. So this one I purposely show as an easy puzzle piece, because people are going to be able to put these things together like puzzles. Like you can, if you have like a LegalZoom contract, and basically this is showing the sale of a website from counterparty A to counterparty B. So very simply, we've got a buyer, their address, a seller, their address, a date, a balance of a currency, and if the currency is sent by that date, the website administration goes from buyer to, or seller to buyer. So that's one example. I know this is probably a little tough to see, but I'll share these slides afterwards. This is a loan. How many people have done a mortgage or a car loan? This is now 30 lines. Very simply, we're importing loan tools. Got it. And I purposely do this for people that are not necessarily all computer scientists, because you can extrapolate the basic information. You've got your debtor, your interest rate, your interest frequency, and the interval of payments. And that's what a loan's going to look like. And imagine a car loan where if you don't pay the car loan, the smart contract shuts off the car. Obviously, you're going to want to pay your loans, but you're going to think about these, and I know that there are societal issues that if you need your car and it's not working, but if you're 90 days behind, 120 days behind, you can start building these things in. This is going to change the way the world works. Has anyone gone through an initial public offering of a company? About $1.5 million on the low side. There's typically 3 or 4 bankers, 3 or 4 attorneys, and this is essentially an initial public offering in 50 lines of code. Same thing. We've got the shares, the unit price, and the distribution mechanism. Going to make commerce exponentially more efficient. So what does this mean? What does this do? So what we're doing is creating a price discovery mechanism for the value of intermediation. So the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation settles $1 quadrillion worth of securities transactions per annum. Very easily, you could take a smart contract that could improve those middle and back office functionality. That's an easy one. It's a 40-year-old company. But what about cool, sexy, Silicon Valley sweetheart Uber? It's peer-to-peer. And this is where I really kind of poke holes into my thesis, because I think that Uber, I took an Uber here today. It provides a great user experience. It provides insurance. It provides reputation, so you know that you're supposedly getting in a car with someone who's a safe driver, and a vice versa for a passenger. It provides the driver a lending facility to potentially buy a car to drive. So there are benefits to intermediation, but what we see is typically intermediaries impose themselves into a transaction and try to extract as much value in a rent-seeking functionality with providing as least value as possible. So you could also have a GPS algorithm and a peer-to-peer smart contract between a reputable driver and a reputable passenger that have earned the reputation. And now the 35% that Uber takes as the intermediary gets pushed out to the two counterparties in the transaction. So they save that type of money. Moreover, what we're going to start seeing are what I call N-sided or multi-sided marketplaces, where you could have an insurer like AIG insure that micro transaction of a 15-minute Uber ride. They can take the data of the reputation of the driver. They can take the smart contract with the GPS algorithm. They can take the reputation of the passenger, and they'll be able to issue these types of minuscule micro insurance contracts, peer-to-peer with Uber. And then you could similarly have a lender that could lend the driver for his ability to purchase a car very similarly. And I think the bottom line with this is you can recreate Uber in a decentralized fashion and squeeze that margin from 35% down to probably 2 to 5%. And you take that and you extrapolate that over Airbnb, Amazon, eBay, Facebook, where instead of Mark being in the middle and you getting it for free, maybe you attract your attention to an advertisement, have the same type of user experience of social media, but you get paid $1 a day. So comparisons of blockchains to the web. FANG, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, Google, you can add Apple out there, you can call it FANGA. The value has been captured at the application layer of the current web. The intermediaries are essentially extracting the lion's share of the value. And again, when we go through that sad face on the oligopolies of all of those internet companies where you've got a Gini coefficient of 80 human beings that have the same net worth as the bottom 3.5 billion people on Earth, that's really I would say 50% of that inefficient Gini coefficient. In the future, that application layer value capture is going to be shrinking dramatically because we're essentially commoditizing trust and commoditizing intermediation. And where the value is going to go to is these protocols. And I bifurcate the protocols into an infrastructure layer and to an application layer. And I'll go into that a little bit, well, I'll go into it now. So I believe we're in the equivalent of 1994 when the internet exploded in 1996. So in the blockchain years, we're really kind of 2 years away from robust scalability, robust applications, really game-changing horizontal disruption. So there's going to be a stack. I think there will be a transactional layer stack. So that's the business logic. That's kind of the glue that holds this together. So the strongest and the most expressive blockchain, in my opinion, is Ethereum. It can compile stateful smart contracts. I believe that to be the business transactional layer. Then there's going to be the need for file storage because it's expensive to store files on a blockchain. Probably the #1 front runner in this regard is something called the Interplanetary File System, IPFS, that was created by Juan Benet Batiz out of Stanford. And he has Filecoin, which is an incentivization mechanism for file storage. It's a fraction of the cost of what Dropbox or Amazon would charge. Next, you're going to have a decentralized peer-to-peer encrypted messaging layer. One that I like is a protocol that's open source named Matrix. It's created by a gentleman, a computer scientist, absolute genius out of Cambridge University named Matthew Hodgson. And then we're going to need a high throughput computing resource. A company by the name of Golem is attempting to accomplish this. This is a very hard problem in computer science. So the winner is not yet to be determined in my eyes. And then you're going to need mesh networking to help kind of make everything work together. Another reason I think we're in 94, 96 is that we're in intranets first. So Microsoft has a little bit of a special place in my heart. I helped create the blockchain as a service offering. So basically with Microsoft, which was the first one ever in history about 3 or 4 years ago. And when you hear about all of these banks doing things on these interledgers, those are all permissioned intranets. And the reason we're using intranets is because the public permissionless internet, or these public permissionless blockchains, as we talked before, haven't hit full scalability and haven't gotten to economically sufficient privacy. So very similar to the early internet days, everyone worked on intranets until the internet exploded. A few things on scalability and a few things on privacy. Zero knowledge proofs, or ZK snarks, is a field of cryptography that had been made famous by a genius mathematician named Zuko Wilcox. It was somewhat famous before then, but he really brought it to the blockchain digital asset space with his creation of Zcash. And ZK snarks have now been embedded into the Ethereum protocol for privacy. And now for scalability, there are 4 main scalability upgrades for the Ethereum protocol. So the first is what's called a state channel. So if I took everybody to the bar and gave the bartender my credit card, I would open the channel on chain. And if I bought everybody a Shirley Temple, that would be the first round. And then if I bought everybody an appetizer and everybody lunch and then everybody dessert, all of those rounds would be essentially batched when I said time to close the tab. And I would close that tab on chain. So basically it's the ability to open a tab on chain, have thousands of microtransactions off chain, and batch them and close them on chain. So that's the first scalability solution. It's working extremely well. Second is the transition from proof of work, which is somewhat wasteful in my opinion in terms of electricity, somewhat redundant, to what's called proof of stake. The proof of stake implementation for Ethereum, which is named Casper, was named after the Ghost protocol, which is the greediest, heaviest observed subtree protocol. was released on New Year's Eve onto the Ethereum testnet. For protocol upgrades, basically they're released on a testnet, and depending upon the importance of the protocol, they're typically there from 30 to 100 days. And that was done on New Year's Eve, so I imagine that upgrade will be imminently forthcoming onto the mainnet. Next is sharding, where essentially shards of the database have to form consensus on the state of the blockchain rather the entire database. So only a percentage has to come to an agreement rather than the entire database. And then lastly is a protocol called Plasma. It was written by Joseph Poon, who also created Lightning networks, which are essentially the state channels for the Bitcoin network. And it's a notion of having like chains on top of blockchains, and then Ethereum becomes this essentially like a Supreme Court. To be completely honest, it's mostly written by PhDs in computer science, and it's a little bit above my pay grade. So I'm not able to answer those questions. So 94 of 96, blockchains still need to prove scalability, still need to prove economic privacy. We've got our stack. Next are standards. For those historians or those old enough to remember the permeation of Java into planet Earth, Java was really created for televisions and then became the most powerful and most commonly used software language throughout the 90s and slightly before. And that was because it had clean web APIs and clean database APIs. So there were standards that were built around it. The Ethereum community created the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance. It now has over 386 members, including Microsoft, JP Morgan, Santander, British Petroleum, UBS, Wipro. There's a ton of them. And basically, they're creating standards at the protocol layer. So having a reference implementation of an enterprise-grade version of Ethereum that sits upon three main pillars. One is configurable consensus, the ability to swap out consensus algorithms depending upon the environment that you're in. So you could conceivably be in a permissioned enterprise PBFT, Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus algorithm, and swap out for proof of stake. Then having roles-based access control, RBAC, and then lastly, having these types of privacy upgrades like ZK snarks. So that's at the protocol layer, and then there are application layer working groups in the EEA stack. So there's a banking working group, a supply chain working group, a healthcare working group, an energy working group. And each one of those working groups are dealing with their respective standards and how to create standards around using this next generation blockchain internet technology in their respective field. And then lastly, we're starting to see the early days of consumer applications, and they are awfully reminiscent of the early internet, with gambling, gaming, and pornography being the early risers. I won't talk anymore about that. So I'm from a firm named ConsenSys. There were about 3 of us 3 years ago, and we're about 700 people all over the world. We've got about, I'd say about 10 now in Africa. 12? 12. He's the boss. And this is our mothership in Brooklyn. It's a crappy loft space where lots of millennials want to eat avocado toast in Bushwick and hang out there rather than a nice place in Manhattan, but they're the ones that are going to run the world tomorrow. ConsenSys operates across 4 main pillars of business. First is product. We maintain 3 of the 8 implementations of the Ethereum protocol. So deep distributed systems, PhD engineers, guys that would be creating things like TCP/IP, HTTP, guys who created the Hadoop cluster, the Java client, the .NET client, the Haskell client. Above that, we create developer tools. So the most used blockchain developer tool is called Truffle. It's built in-house. It's open source. We've gifted it to the world. We've created a load balancer named Infura. It's like Akamai for blockchains. It handles 6 billion requests per day. It's free, gifted to the world. Above that, we create open source standards. So if we're going to disintermediate every intermediating power of the internet right now, we have to create the user experience that they offer. Things like identity, things like reputation, things like registries, things like payment systems. So to that extent, we've created registry systems, open source, identity systems, open source, wallets, logins, did I say reputation? Reputation. And basically those can be used in any application. So if you're building a poker app or a music app or a banking app, all of them are going to need a login with an identity. So those are these open source standards that are being implemented in many different applications that aren't even necessarily our own, just across the industry. And we get those to the world. And then we have the application layer. So we run our application layer like a venture studio model. BetaWorks, Techstars, 500 startups made that model very famous. Idea becomes a project, project becomes a product. Product can spin out to be its own separate company. The entrepreneurs who built that product now own equity in that company, and ConsenSys owns some equity in that company. And all the while, they've had the abilities for economies of scale and haven't had legal, accounting, and finance and HR. Next, we have enterprise and government consulting. Clients include the South African Reserve Bank. Pete Munnings is here. I don't know where he is. There he is. He's the lead engineer working with the South African Reserve Bank. He also built out the Monetary Authority of Singapore's digitization and tokenization of assets for real-time gross settlement of fiat currency. Other clients include Microsoft, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, British Petroleum, Procter & Gamble, the Emirate of Dubai, where we're the strategic advisor, where they've said that they are going to put every government document on a blockchain by 2020. Then we have an education arm, and then we have a capital markets arm. So I just want to leave you with a few quick use cases to just kind of cement this. It's been somewhat esoteric. This is a woman named Imogen Heap. She's a British Madonna. I never heard of her. And basically, she didn't want to spend any money with iTunes. iTunes takes 35% of the revenue for every album or every song that's purchased, and they pay the artist 3 to 6 months later. And Imogen put a song on the Ethereum blockchain. For round numbers, it cost $1. And if a fan purchased it peer-to-peer, 80% of the dollar would go to Imogen's wallet, 5% would go to the drummer, 5% to the bass player, 5% to the guitarist, based upon this pre-agreed smart contract. And it cost 1% to run that smart contract, all peer-to-peer. So you took 35%, condenses the margin to 1. And you can create that arbitrarily complex business logic. This is BHP Billiton, largest natural resources mining company in the world. They extract rock in the ground, and if the rock tastes like, smells like, feels like oil, that's where they put these $150 million rigs. We created a provenance tracking system to track these assets, these rocks that are actually worth more than diamonds, because those rocks determine where the oil is for them. And this is a microgrid, where if Alice and Bob live across the street and the microgrid hits, or the sunlight hits the photovoltaic array, we were able to literally tokenize the electron and sell that electron peer-to-peer from Alice to Bob. Interestingly, in this example, Bob isn't a person, but it's a grocery store. And this is a way for the world to offset their electricity spend, because when most people don't need energy is when they're at work and their houses aren't using it, but the grocery store's refrigerators constantly need that energy. So this was a way that was done initially in Brooklyn and then was done with RWE, Germany's largest utility, in making their grocery stores more efficient in terms of electricity.
Sorry, Andrew, do you mind? I'm sorry to interrupt, but we do have to break for tea now.
Okay.
Would you mind being around so people can come and ask you questions or
Sure.
speak to you? Thank you very much, though. Thank you for your
Okay.
insights. Thank you.